So, welcome to Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month at Foothill College. My name is Dr. Scott Langford. I'm a professor of English here at Foothill College, or virtual Foothill College. As you can see from my virtual background, I'm also the Director of Outreach and Communication for something called the Global Educators Network, which is being launched in collaboration with Stanford Global Studies. So I am here thrilled to welcome Andrew Lam, who has been a guest at Foothill College on many occasions. He's actually one of our favorite ever guest speakers. But this is the first time that he's joining us live from Saigon, not the first time that he's joined us on the anniversary of the quote-unquote Fall of Saigon, April 30th today, but certainly the first time that he's joining us from Saigon. So the first thing I want to say is, hello, Andrew, and welcome back virtually to Foothill College.
Hello from Viet Nam, where it's midnight.
Yes, and thank you for staying up. Thank you for staying up so late, because it is really something special for us. I'm stopping the screen share.
Yeah.
And as you know, I just want to make sure for those that are just joining us, much of the audience is comprised of my English 1C Honors Institute class at Foothill College. And we have been reading your work, listening to some of your podcasts. But some of you may be joining us from other places. And if you go to the foothill.edu website and look for API Heritage Month, you will find links to all of the readings that we've been sharing this week with Andrew Lam as homework for my class, to which we might be referring. Then I just want to give a really quick intro, which then leads into the question about who Andrew is. I'm very proud to have known him for some years, although I first came to know him with one of his many hats on. I think the first time I became aware of him, he produced and more or less starred in a documentary about returning to Viet Nam on PBS. So he was in my world. He was first a star on PBS in a very important and much loved documentary, a whole series about returning to Vietnam, having resettled at the age of 11 after the fall of Saigon in what is now my hometown of Daly City. So I always have to give a shout out to those of us in Daly City. Two Daly City boys here, both refugees from elsewhere. I was just a refugee from Palo Alto, but I'm very happy here. Andrew has since relocated largely to Saigon recently, and we'll be hearing about that. I just want to mention a couple other things in his biography, and then I'll be asking him questions about much of the rest of it. But in addition to being an award-winning PBS documentarian, he's a much loved radio personality on NPR, both locally here in the Bay Area through our local station KALW, and nationally frequently. So I have frequently, when I was actually still driving to Foothill College, heard Andrew's voice on NPR as I was listening to Morning Edition with his commentaries, which he's been doing for years. He is an award-winning journalist. He's also an award-winning fiction writer, and so he's had everything from television journalism to print journalism. He blogs, he does the rest, and all of that happens. Chris, you have your
could you please make Jobin co-host?
Oh, yes, I think you can too, by the way.
I can.
Okay, let me do that. I'll just pause. In fact, I'll do that in just a second after I finish my intro. How about
Cool.
that? One other thing that I wanted to mention, Andrew, before I let you kind of take over here and ask you this question, I just want to say, because we did have Sandeep Roy as a guest earlier, that one of the things that I'm really proud to say about you is that, and I want my students especially to know, is that you were a co-founder of something called New American Media. And that was a pioneering organization that completely changed the landscape of journalism and radio journalism in the United States. And really short form, radio and print journalism were very dominated by white males. Let's just put it bluntly, like dear me here. And Andrew's organization, New American Media, that he formed here out of the Bay Area with a number of other Bay Area writers and radio hosts, broke so many glass ceilings. And now the fact that you hear non-white voices on the radio frequently, not as frequently as I would like, but much more frequently, was due to that amazing and pioneering work. And I think the whole of journalism in the United States owes you a debt for that. And I'm sorry that I guess it recently, like so much of journalism, didn't make it into 2020. Nevertheless, I do feel like it's one of the many accomplishments that you have, and one that I really want people to know about, and one that I just wanted to call out. So, having said all that, I'm going to lead in with my first question for Andrew, and let him get a word in edgewise, and stop blushing. I always try to make him blush because I am really proud to have him as a guest. So since this, I guess I wanted to start with the fact that here you are joining us for the first time from Vietnam. You've always been there in the Harside Room physically at Foothill College. You have visited us on the anniversary of the quote unquote Fall of Saigon. And as you know very well, and I know partly from reading your stuff, that's not the only way to refer to that event, to say the least. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering how does it feel different to you joining an API Heritage Month, which you've helped us out with many times before? Does it feel different speaking from Saigon this time in terms of your own perspective and just how this fits into our Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month event?
Wow, start out with a really difficult question.
Ah.
Well, it's a very strange thing to be here because I'm someone who holds a lot of memory of the Vietnam War as a child, and who's written about the consequences of war and having lost wars and become refugees and living in exile, and all these things are sort of the central theme of a lot of my writing. And yet here I am back in the country in which, I fled from, and living, I think, rather well, and yet still addressing that wound, of being a part of the diaspora that resulted from of the end of the war. But it is a country in which people have now, overall, I would say, a sense of amnesia in regards to that war, because Vietnam is such a forward-looking country full of young people that, like, for instance, today, there is no mention of having won that war against the South and the Americans, nor is there a parade to speak of like they used to have in the past, because we're all having this pandemic, and also Vietnam is now fully focused on fighting a different war, to make sure that they win against the coronavirus infection. And they, in fact, are doing an excellent job in comparison with other countries. We already have, the lift of shelter in place 2 days ago, and life comes back in full. People now are back on the street, in the restaurants, making a living, and they have no mention of this Vietnam War memory that I think is still very much a deep wound for the US as well as the Vietnamese diaspora. But here, no one talks about it. It's almost as if a young person being asked about, say, Watergate, and he would just shrug his shoulders because it means nothing to him at this point. And this is something that I find really interesting in the sense of how history moved forward, is that by the next generation, no one really has this direct memory of that war or what it means, and in general, people just tend to move forward and make a living.
Yeah, it brings to mind the Carl Sandburg poem about the grass growing over the graves in France a century ago, when the last great influence of the pandemic. so there is that. I guess I should also go ahead and let you tell a little bit of your story, especially for those of you, unlike my students, who haven't yet had a chance to read some of the articles that we linked to.
Yeah.
In terms of how you became a Daly City kid, like me, these exactly 45 years ago, more or less, right?
Yeah.
2 days plus or minus a couple of days, right? I know you didn't first land in Daly City, but
No.
here we are, the 45th anniversary. So how does Andrew Lam end up in Saigon?
Yeah, you mean in Daly City or
Oh, I'm
Saigon?
sorry, in Daly City. I got it backwards. Excuse me.
So well, 45 years ago exactly, well, plus 2 days, I left Vietnam on an airplane full of refugees, and we headed for the Philippines, the Subic Bay. And then from there, we went to Guam, where there was a freshly bulldozed ground area where tents were being put up for, the first wave of Vietnamese refugees at the end of the Vietnam War. And I remember because I had a backpack with me, and in it was an address of my aunt who had a restaurant on Mission Street, at the end of Mission Street, near the top of the hill, Daly City. I still remember the address. It's 6233 Mission Street. And she was the first to own a Vietnamese restaurant in Daly City. And she was married to a career diplomat who divorced her, and she lived in the US, and that was our destination. Even if we get lost or family get torn apart, we're all gonna plan to meet at this address. So my mother made me memorize it deeply into my brain that I still remember the address after all these years. And surely enough, we all got to Guam, and then we resettled in, we got taken in by the US 3 weeks later into Camp Pendleton, which is south of Los Angeles. And from there, we made our way up to San Francisco, where my aunt welcomed us into a 2-bedroom apartment in Daly City. And there were 2 families with us, my mom, our family, and then my aunt's family. And the 3 of families started living together in this 2-bedroom apartment. I think there were like 16 of us. And then we started working in that restaurant that my aunt owned, while looking for jobs and that sort of thing. And so, it was a sheer madness of crowd. But I remember being like very fascinated with America because, I'd never been out of the country, and here I am in a new world, and everything was new and fascinating. And I spent a lot of time outside of the apartment, obviously, because it's too crowded. So I explored the world, I explored Daly City, and, made a lot of friends. And within a few months, I started speaking English and forgetting Vietnamese. And within 2 years, I changed my name and became sort of this American kid. It took a long time to return back to my roots, but so that's how I ended up in Daly City.
Well, there we go. And you might as well, I think I might as well get you to continue the story forward, because this is where where your life not all of my students are of quote unquote traditional college age. Of course, It's community college, and we love that our students are anywhere from 16 to 66 and up and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
However, but in terms of off to college and how that all happened, I'm sure they would love to hear that story.
Yeah.
Partly because that's where they are now. Here they are. So when you were taking, say, English 1C or 1A or all that, how did that? Who was Andrew Lam by then?
So I, wasn't planning to become a writer or journalist or anyone in the media exactly. I was a biochem major at Berkeley because my parents pretty much had an idea what each of us was going to become in America. You have to appreciate the fact that we were refugees and immigrants, and we didn't really, have a lot of resources. And so a lot of people who are first generation to America don't have fanciful ideas about careers. They tend to work in area that could make money. And so there's a tendency for a lot of Vietnamese of my generation to study medicine or engineering or computer science. EECS was very big and so on. And so my brother became an engineer. My sister studied business, and I was supposed to be a doctor. That's how they decided. And so then when I got into Berkeley, I was a biochem degree major. I didn't even question it. I was just very obedient to my parents. I read a lot, growing up in Daly City. And I just didn't think I was going to be a writer. I just read, put that aside, and study biochemistry as part of what being a filial Confucian trained child in a Vietnamese family dictated. And so I just sort of went merrily along. But something odd happened during that time is that instead of just being sort of like a studious Vietnamese student at Berkeley, I ended up falling in love. And when this love affair ended, I graduated and I worked in a cancer research lab while applying to medical school, but I spent most of my time, instead of studying, writing about my love affair, just for fun. And I took classes after, because I already graduated, and I took UC extension courses in creative writing, just to find a way to tell this heartbreak of mine. The odd thing about it was I didn't know how to write about my love affair, because I only had one and I didn't know how to write. But I kept at it, and then one day I looked at one of the passages that I wrote, which all of that is mentioned in my second book, by the way, called East Eats West. But I look at my writing, and there was a passage that says something along the line of, if you love someone and share your life with someone, and then when you lose that someone, you in fact have lost a country, and you in fact have become an exile. And then when I read that, I broke down and cried. I didn't cry when I wrote it. I read it. When I read it months later, I cried, and I didn't know why. And it slowly dawned on me that I was not writing about my romantic heartbreak. I was actually trying to talk about what it was like to be that Vietnamese child in that refugee camp, listening to the news of the BBC telling me and my family and everyone around me that the world that I came from has disappeared and under communism, and that I have become stateless, and what it felt like to lose everything you knew and loved. So then I cried, and I realized, oh, so this wasn't my first heartbreak, but it was my second heartbreak, this romance. And so instead of writing about me and my big romantic heartbreak, I started writing more about the Vietnamese people, what it's like to lose a country. And so then the heartbreak becomes the tragedy of exile, the tragedy of loss. And I returned slowly to my own history. And by the second class I took with this teacher, I remember I came into class, and she said, Andrew, I know you're supposed to go to medical school, but I send your stories to San Francisco State Creative Writing Program, and they told me that you should just go and apply, because you will get in, because they want you. And I said, oh my God, my mom is going to kill me. And I applied, and I got into the creative writing program, which of course, my mother literally broke down and wept when I told her I'm not going to medical school, that I in fact was going to creative writing program in San Francisco. My whole family, in fact, were shocked and disappointed. And my dad, who later actually published 2 books of his own, basically challenged me and say, listen, we're immigrants, we're refugees. How can you hope to make a living writing in English? And this is 1988, 89, you know, when I got accepted to the master program. And he say, and mind you, the Vietnam War ended in 1975, so that's only about 15 years after the fact. You know, so it's a very young community, first generation mostly, and people were trying to buy a house, working 2 jobs, and sending money back to Vietnam to their relatives they left behind. No one was like, I'm going to be a writer, writing in English, you know, at that time. And so my dad issued a challenge, and he said, name for me just one Vietnamese who was making a living writing in English in America, and I'll let you go. And I couldn't name one because, in fact, there were none. And so I kept thinking, like, wait a minute, there's nobody making a living right now writing in English. And so I told my dad that, Dad, it's going to be me.
And you were right.
And that was the first time my dad looked at me in that funny way, like, wow, this kid, you know, got some guts, you know, and so, but I was desperate. I couldn't come up with a name, and my mom's like, "Oh my God, I knew it. Sending you to Berkeley was a mistake because now you have become a hippie." And I said, "No, Mom, I'm not a hippie. I'm just going to graduate school." but you know, it took them a long time to turn around, but I was very lucky because when I got into the master program at San Francisco State, I was quickly, quote unquote, discovered by, you know, Sandy Close, who was an editor of Pacific News Service, and the writer Richard Rodriguez. And Richard basically took me under his wings and gave me books by incredible essayists like Joan Didion, Tom Wolfe, and people, you know, V.S. Naipaul. People whose work I didn't notice because I tended to read more novels than nonfiction. And they this book, you know, James Baldwin, they opened up the whole new world to me. And Richard basically say, I know you want to tell the stories that you know and love in fiction form, but you know, you can do the same. You can still bring your literary voice into the world of journalism. And I never thought that was possible. What Richard and Sandy gave me was this sense that you can bring your literary voice into the nonfiction world and bring your whole personality to bear in witnessing the unfolding of history. And that gave me a lot of solace because I tend to have this literary approach to things. So then I started writing op-ed and news analysis, but often in the first person, I. And so within a few months after being quote unquote discovered by them, I started writing essays for Pacific News Service and getting published, and then started winning awards while being a student at San Francisco State, which is really bizarre. Within a year, they actually got money funding to send me to write about refugees in Hong Kong, because I was the only writer, journalist who actually can access Vietnamese boat people and interview them in the camp. And so that was my first overseas gig in 1991, was to go to Hong Kong and get into those camps and tell the story from inside out. And then I won an international award from that. And then I wrote some more, and then they say, go to Cambodia because the Khmer Rouge are giving up arms and you should write about democracy in Cambodia. So I flew to Cambodia, wrote about that. And then the next year they say, go to Vietnam and write about the thaw of the Cold War and what it means to be in Vietnam now that the Soviet Union no longer in control of that country. And that was like a big story, but also a big assignment, an emotional one, because I didn't think I would ever get back to Vietnam during the Cold War, right? And next thing you know, I'm a journalist covering this inside Vietnam, and it was an emotional return in '91. You know, and it was such a big story that, you know, I was 20 something, 24, 25. And so I didn't know how to tell that story. It took me a long time. And what really helped was I walked around my childhood haunts in Saigon, trying to figure out a way to tell the thought of the Cold War and what it's like to be Vietnamese at that time. And I went to the zoo. And at the zoo, during that time, and you have to appreciate Vietnam was so poor. It was dirt poor in 1991. It just got released from the Soviet Union. It was in debt. It was embargoed by the United States. It had fought like a 10-year war in Cambodia and occupying it. So it was out of resources, you know. And I walked into the zoo exactly on the day when an elephant had died. And people were lining up. And I thought, that's so weird. And with buckets. And what they were doing was they were buying elephant meat to eat because Vietnam didn't have enough meat at that time. And so people were buying elephant, like old elephant meat by the kilo. And it was stunning to me, you know. It kind of brought me back to that essay by George Orwell, you know, Death of an Elephant, which is a brilliant piece of writing. And I thought, okay, so this is the distillation of the aftermath of the Cold War as experienced through like meat-eating elephant, like the death of an elephant in Vietnam. So I wrote about that, right? So the big story told through the dramatization of everyday event. And I won an international award from that. And then so sort of after that, my life just kind of spin into this whole world of journalism. So if in a weird way, it's an accidental career, you know, because I started out writing about my broken romance, but it ended up being a career in something else altogether. And I never managed to write about my broken heart either.
Well, since your broken heart was at Berkeley, you know, I don't think I've ever asked you, what was it like for you as a Vietnamese American student and in Berkeley? Because you must have been, you know, part of the first wave. I was vividly remembering the first time that one of my teachers, actually, one of my mentors handed to me, said, you have to read Maxine Hong Kingston's book, The Woman Warrior, which was the first work by an Asian American author that I had ever read, because no one, again, there were no names and it wasn't part of the canon. Now, you know, Maxine Hong Kingston is now a revered part of American literature, but she was a Berkeley-based writer. And that was, for me, as someone studying American literature, that was a life-changing experience.
Yeah. Well, she actually taught at Berkeley when I was there. So
that's what I was kind of thinking, right? So
that's when I met her.
Yeah,
because she wrote blurbs to all three of my three books. You know, so I consider her a mentor and a friend. But she taught there when I was there. So, but it was strange. I'll tell you how I felt. Berkeley actually was the center of Asian American study movement. You know, that's where the OGs were, right? But what happened is that movement really came into power when there was this incident where this auto worker named Vincent Chin was murdered. I think it was in Detroit. And that was a big story. And it galvanized Asian Americans, you know, because during that time, Japanese industry was rising and Toyota was beating all this, companies from the US. And so people were losing their jobs. And then this guy, I guess, took it out on Vince, you know, on Chin. And anyway, so there was this whole feeling of racism, dealing with racism for Asian Americans. But my problem with it was that there was also an assumption that all Asians were American born and that we didn't have an accent and we're just as American as the next person. And what bothered me about it was that, in fact, Vietnamese were not like that. We actually were part of this new wave of Asian immigrants that were coming in and changing the demographic of what makes an Asian American. In fact, by now, 2 out of 3 of Asian American are foreign born, right? But when I was at Berkeley, that was not true. When I was at Berkeley, the predominant population of Asian in the US were American born. And so there was an assumption that you should be more American in some way than, and so someone like me who speaks other languages, who has an accent, or who carries another set of history that's not related to Asian American experience, were not really part of the way in which stories were told in Asian American study, which is to say there were no Southeast Asian studies, there was no immigrant studies to speak of in addition to the narrative of Asian American story, you know. And so I felt kind of left out. And I think at that time, there were more and more movement demanding that Asian American study includes Southeast Asian story classes. And that was when they started hiring Professor Chung Chung. I'm not sure you know who he was. He was the first Vietnamese lecturer at Berkeley teaching Vietnamese American studies, you know. And I remember because he's a very good friend of mine now because he also here in Vietnam. And, you know, he had to cobble together like newspaper articles because there were no Vietnamese American writing stuff yet. So there weren't a lot of materials as part of the syllabus. So he has to hustle just to teach this class, I remember, because I took the class, so I should remember. So what it was like to be Vietnamese at Berkeley is just like what it's like to be Vietnamese in the US at that time, is to be misunderstood, right? I had people come up to me and say, if you won the war, why are you here? This is at Berkeley, yeah. Because people were not aware that there was a civil war and the South had lost, you know, having sided with the Americans. And so then they were forced out of the country. There were young people who came up to me and say, if you won, why are you here? So that's how narrow how ignorant the mass was in relationship to the history of the Vietnam War. So what it was like is, you know, I constantly felt like I had to explain my history. I think part of the reason why I passionately wrote at the beginning was also trying to explain what happened to me and my people and what we had to go through to become American, right? So a lot of my early work was explanation.
Yeah, and I'll put in a little footnote for Foothill College, which I'm fond of doing since we're hosting you here, that you know, we've had a proud tradition at Foothill College and in the Bay Area in general, of course. One of the first Vietnamese American journalists for San Jose Mercury News came out of Foothill College journalism program. Andrew X Pham, P-H-A-M, who's another very celebrated Vietnamese American writer. Actually started his creative writing career by taking creative writing classes at Foothill College. He didn't get a degree from Foothill College, but he did take some of our creative writing classes. So that's part of sort of like this rise of new writers coming out of Berkeley, out of San Francisco State, out of San Jose State, out of the community college system. The Bay Area has really been the epicenter of what is now a huge and thriving and ever-growing part of American literatures.
Right.
I kind of want to let me ask you this too. This is to circle back to where we are now, since you're joining us from Saigon, and it's now now here we are many years later. One of the things that I've learned by reading you and other Vietnamese American writers with some pain, and it's made me cringe a bit lately, like the big meme lately in COVID coverage just 2 days ago, and I think you must have heard it, like all of a sudden NPR and everyone else was announcing that more Americans had died of COVID-19 than had died in the Vietnam War. And what always makes me cringe, and you in part have made me aware of, is that whenever we talk about the casualties of the Vietnam War, and of course that was tragic and tens of thousands of Americans died, but leaving out the far, 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 almost unimaginably greater casualties that happened in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Laos, and never mentioning that at all, right? So when we say more people died, we we completely eclipsed the idea that anyone but Americans died in that war.
Yeah.
And you've really taught me to hear that. So now when I hear it on NPR or anywhere else, there's that little light goes on in my head. But do you want to comment on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I've been hearing that a lot on social media as well, and I find that this is why we needed people telling stories from their own experience, because 58,000 over 58,000 Americans did die in the war, but I think 2.5 million Vietnamese died from that war, so or more. So if you are going to compare deaths, then you should be inclusive rather than be self-centered. But this is a problem I have in general with American journalism, and my pet peeve, and also why I started New American Media with Sandy and other people, because there was always a feeling of being excluded in that storytelling and what's important, right? So New American Media is trying, or was trying, now that no longer exists, to be inclusive and bring in different perspective from that same story. But say what it's like to be an immigrant during this time, or what is it like to be a documented immigrant when this thing is expanding, but not the stimulus, but not touching you, and you're just sort of like disappear from the mind frame of care and so on. And so to read all about just how American die when in fact other people die as well, I'm not sure how constructive that is, because it brings to mind that the way the media works is that it just focuses on itself so often without having a larger framework. For instance, when usually during this time, like 20, 30 years or 40-year anniversary at the end of the Vietnam War, which is today, is the 45th. A lot of American journalists will come to Vietnam to cover the one and single story, Agent Orange, as a way to look at what we did to Vietnam narrative. When I try to tell them that, in fact, Vietnam is facing this array of environmental degradation that has nothing to do with the US, has to do with China damming all these Mekong rivers, has to do with toxicity in the way the agrarian life is. It has to do with salination and so on, or deforestation. They looked at me as if like, why are you bringing up that topic? We are only interested in Agent Orange as a story. It's problematic because why? Because if you're really in Vietnam trying to tell the story of Vietnam, are you really telling the story of Vietnam, or you're just only there using Vietnam as a mirror to reflect on your own anguish? And it's problematic because I'm not saying Agent Orange is not a legitimate story, but it is definitely not the only story when you talk about tragedies that are befalling in this country. But it's very hard to convince American otherwise, because somehow we always want to be in the center of a narrative in order to understand that story. But it's a fallacy, because if you're always in the center of a story, you may actually miss the real story.
Yes, and I just want to thank you for, as both an author of fiction and nonfiction, again, in a beautiful way. I personally have benefited from that decentering and listening to these other voices, because I very much grew up in that bubble, and even beginning in grad school, fortunately not ending grad school, yeah. That bubble very badly needed to be burst. And of course, that's part of what we're doing here with Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, trying to bring as many voices as we can. And so it's very fitting that I really do enjoy the idea that you're our sort of encore and ultimate presentation for API Heritage Month. It's literally the last day of the month,
yeah,
literally the 45th anniversary. And you are probably our most frequent and favorite author. I should mention, for those that are joining us from other other places or other classes. Andrew's books are very widely assigned, not just by me, but by many of my colleagues in the English department. And that's because we love his writing, and because students love his writing. It is deep and powerful, and students respond to it really powerfully. And maybe this is a place that I can begin to ask my co-host, Chris and Joubin, whether we want to start to bring in some questions from our participant audience out there in Zoom land. I see that my colleague, Professor Svetich, is here with us. Thank you for joining us, Kella. And I haven't really glanced at the whole list, but do we have some questions queued up yet, Chris or Joubin?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, Disha, you can go ahead.
Okay, great. Andrew, thank you so much for speaking to us today. Your story is absolutely incredible and inspiring. So in the beginning of your lecture, you kind of talked about how Vietnam had essentially, or the Vietnamese have essentially kind of forgotten about the Vietnam War, and when it stands to be such an influential part of your upbringing and
Yeah.
your ultimate identity, like, what do you think is the cause for this kind of amnesia, and how do you think it's affecting the population today?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I'll give you the background. Vietnam population now is around 97 million, going on 98, I think.
Mm-hmm.
When I left Vietnam in 1975, both North and South combined was probably less than 30 million.
Oh, wow.
So within the 45-year framework, it tripled. And so then what does that mean? It means that several generations had been born after that war. And Vietnam having won the war and being a monopolitical party system, which is to say authoritarian and communist, it imposed a kind of a very simplistic, I would say, story about liberating the South and having won a war against American imperialism, and basically simplify that narrative into sort of a propaganda tool, which it still uses more or less in school, but it doesn't inspire because, it's like, yeah, we won a war against American imperialism and so on. And so people in school don't really dwell on that kind of narrative, especially because increasingly with the Vietnamese diaspora sending money home and with young people traveling overseas, because Vietnam has become a lot more wealthy than since 91, since I came back, they know that they've been spoon-fed a lie, a fictional version of that war. They don't know what the real story is because the real story is not allowed to be told, or the real stories not allowed to be told in Vietnam. So then there is often a shrug off attitude here regarding history, right? Because I remember hanging out with American journalists about 15 years ago in Vietnam, and they asked me to ask young people, because they didn't speak Vietnamese, what they thought of the war. And the first question these young people responded was, which one?
Okay.
Why? Because Vietnam had actually had 5 wars since the 20th century. And so if all wars are part of history, then like the war against the French, the Civil War, the war in Cambodia, the war against China and so on, it's all part of history. So when the American asked, what do you think of the war? They meant the Vietnam War. For the Vietnamese, when you say, what do you think of the war? They say, well, which one? Because we had several, right? Which is to say everything now is part of history. And so if you ask someone who is now in his 20s in the US, what do you think of Watergate or Nixon scandal? What do you think their attitude would be? Or I'm outraged, or or actually, do they actually know what it's about?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What do you think the effects of that single story were, though, on this new generation that was raised after
Yeah.
the war?
Wow, good question. I think the general effect of depriving people a way to discover the real story, because Vietnam is still very much an authoritarian police regime, that is that they won't allow discovery. Meaning, like, I worked on as a consultant to Ken Burns' The Vietnam War History, and they had a hard time introducing that whole series in Vietnam because Vietnam is still very much wary about introducing something that deep and in depth about the Vietnam War. So they don't want Vietnamese people to think deeply about, the truth. So the single narrative, what overall effect is what I talked about, is that there is a general amnesia. People just aren't informed about what had happened in previous generation. And because of that, there is a very strange sense that I am in a new country, because the only people who hold memory of that war are either people like me who came back from overseas, or older generation who had fought in that war and actually had living memory. But otherwise, it's a non-starter. People just don't care.
Hmm. Wow. Okay.
You know, Andrew, I would argue that there's an equal amnesia in American culture about the Vietnam War, and this may just be the aging boomer talking here.
Yeah.
But just as I would never assume that students know a thing about Watergate,
Yeah.
and I don't mean this in a condescending way. I think for my generation, I thought I had quote unquote heard of the Korean War.
Mm-hmm.
I had uncles that served in the Korean War,
Yeah.
but it was just like one sentence in a textbook to me. I knew nothing, at least until series like in TV. There was a famous TV series called MASH. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean, really, until MASH came along, which
Yeah.
was an award-winning, which was a very popular series, I knew nothing
Yeah.
about the Korean War. And I feel like my students now are very much like me then, except that now it's Vietnam, or worse, that when they do know something, it is a completely rewriting of history kind of version. And of course,
Yeah.
this has become very politicized. But what if I said to you, I think the amnesia is as bad or worse in America? What would be your reaction?
Well, I think it's just I don't disagree, except for there are differences. For instance, the amnesia is definitely true, and I think in general you can say this is the curse of being human. We tend to forget the drama, but I think in a country like the U.S. and other places where you have protected speech and so on, as a single individual, you have the right to do discovery. You can actually do research, you can do documentary, you can share your insights about that war and not get into trouble. In a country like Vietnam, if there are true intellectual curiosity, it is done in private and in the dark, because there is no conference on what that war means for the North or South. There is no literary events in which people who write about the war get to meet in this country. Vietnam is very wealthy compared to like Laos and Cambodia now, but it doesn't have a literary event that invites foreign writers or the diaspora to come back to compare, their story versus the story that the government tells, right? You can go to Singapore even, where you have that kind of book festival and people bring different history to it, but in Vietnam it's non-existent still, which is really sad to me. In America there is definitely amnesia, but there is also individual curiosity, and you have people like Ken Burns who are willing to make a documentary and with an extraordinary amount of resources to do that kind of retelling of the war, right? In the country like Vietnam, there's no such thing, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, did you feel that Ken Burns got it right? I've actually read some of your stuff on this, but I know part of the answer. I see you shaking your head. And I'm not sure, again, it would be very interesting to me if I had the poll working on Zoom. I would love to know how many of my students watched any of that or knew that existed. That's the funny part of it. I'm not sure that for my younger students, they were tuned into Ken Burns.
Yeah.
Jobin and Chris did. That's great to know.
I'm a big fan of Ken Burns.
Say a few words since some of them did. So what was your reaction to the series with all of its resources and its fame and the full power of PBS behind it?
Since I work as a consultant in part, I it's harder for me to say, but I would say that one of the reasons why I agreed to help out was because there was this promise of bringing different voices into the narrative, which has always been the mission of what I did before as a journalist, which is to say interviewing people like my father or people who fought in the war in the North, and so on, which is also to say Vietnamese point of view rather than simply American version of that war. But the end result was still very much a American-centric narrative. And maybe that's inevitable because it is about America. But I can tell you that we spent 5-6 hours interviewing my father. And I think he had like 3 or 4 minutes in that series, and he poured his heart out. That was his last interview because I don't think he'll ever do another one. Part because he suffered from dementia now, but the other is like he doesn't trust American media to tell his story. And there are, 90 hours of footage of interviews of people who told the Vietnamese perspective of that war that are not included. Because again, it's pick and choose to tell a kind of a thesis about why we got into that war as Americans, And so there are incredible stories that are left out that would have told a different way of looking at that war. So I think there's a Vietnamese documentary filmmaker in the US who basically said, if you want to tell the war story, you need to tell it on your own rather than relying on someone else to tell your story for you, which I fully believe. I mean, it's a multi-sided narrative, and whoever gets to tell it will inevitably tell it the way they see it and not the way everyone else sees it. I would even say this pandemic, by the time we tell story about it, will deprive people of point of view because whoever tells the story will pick and choose, right? But there's so many different angles to what happened right now in the US. And so I don't think one documentary will ever do justice because we're talking about ethnic experiences that are different with the virus, class differences. We're talking about political turmoil, so we're talking about like so many ways of slicing this pie, right? And the Vietnam War was like that. Just imagine Vietnam War was a complicated multinational narrative. And when it gets told, it becomes sort of this thin strip of story. And that's why we would never fully understand trauma because, there's different experiences that are not fully shared.
Okay, and Chris and Jubin, do we have some more student questions queued up for Andrew?
Kella is next.
I didn't really have a question. I was actually responding to the thing about amnesia, and I was kind of talking about historical amnesia. There's Hans, by the way.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Andrew. I miss picking you up from the train station.
How are you?
And I'm teaching your stuff in something by you, at least in 1A, 1B, and in Asian American literature right now.
Yeah.
So 3 out of my 4 classes are reading you.
Wow, I'm honored. I think it's kind of ironic because when I was at Asian American Study, I took courses there at Berkeley, there was nothing that's reflective of my own story, and now it's kind of awesome because like Vietnamese American in particular are going through this period of I would say renaissance. Of course there should be more, but in fact you have the last few years incredible work that come out of the community, and not just Viet Thanh Nguyen who won the Pulitzer, but you have Ocean Vuong, you have Thi Bui, and more writings are coming out, and it's really extraordinary. It makes you think that it takes about 40 years for a community to find its voice in America.
Yeah, Natalia Menendez is on here as well, and she said that she's teaching Grandma's Tales. So. It's nice to at least
So,
see your face, everybody. All right, I'm putting myself on mute.
okay.
Jamie's next. Jamie, are you there?
Hi, I have to close my window.
Okay.
Sorry, that was really loud. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you? So my question today is basically about James Baldwin.
Yeah.
And you quoted him in your speech, and then you also mentioned him this morning in your interview. So I wanted to know more about how his work has impacted your writing and racial views.
Yeah, I quoted him in Perfume Dreams as well. That's my memoir. So he's quite influential in the way I write. I think he's an incredible writer first of all, but also a spiritual writer. And I find solace in seeing someone with such powerful voice who wrote at a time of political turmoil in America and wrote with such strong conviction that his voice matters, that his point of view matters. And here was a Black gay man, living at a time of segregation, who insisted that his voice is important in the conversation about race and identity in America. And so seeing his success, seeing how influential he became in America, gave me this idea that here is someone who lives on the margin as well, me being Vietnamese and so on, that somehow I matter, that my story matters, that in time, what I experienced and what I saw happen to people around me is part of the American narrative as well. Yeah. And so I think having seen Baldwin writing from the margin toward the center that way gave me this sense that I too can do the same.
Nice, thank you. That was really great. And I love to hear more about authors I really enjoy and how they inspired you. And I also really like the fact that his work and his quotes are so universal, like the one that you mentioned that says, people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them.
Yeah.
And then you're just basically saying that history is trapped in you. But like, I feel like the way you described like learning, basically embracing your Vietnamese past and learning that's still very part of your present, even though like in America, you kind of have to keep moving away from it, and that's not what should be encouraged. Like it should be encouraged to embrace that part of you. And I'm really glad you were able to study and do documentaries about that and really come to terms with it. It's in a way coming to terms with parts of yourself. So I think that's really great. Thank you.
Thank you. I think part of my struggle at the beginning was always this whole simplistic idea of binary. If you want to be American, then you should not be Vietnamese. And if you want to be Vietnamese, you shouldn't be American. And for me, it's as a kid, one of the reasons why I quote unquote forget Vietnamese language was because I felt ashamed of being Vietnamese when I first came to America. I wanted to fit in so badly, right? Yeah. But having integrated, I felt somehow like I was not fully me, being this English-speaking kid, because there's this whole part of me that I have to cut out in order to sort of like sound American and so on. And only when I was telling folks at the earlier part of this talk that when I began to turn around and talk about what had happened to me, what had happened to my people, and telling it in the American English language fully to a larger public, that I felt that I'm bringing my full life to bear, and that was only when I actually realized that I have been depriving myself of myself, right? And so in a way, being American is being Vietnamese. Like being Vietnamese is being American. You have to find a way to synthesize these opposite ideas. And that actually was the beginning of my intellectual life, really.
And it's unfortunate to hear that like people within your own community in America weren't encouraging that anymore. Like they weren't encouraging to stay true to cultural values. And it was really shocking to hear that people on Berkeley's campus were asking you why you're there, weren't encouraging more unity within students there that are refugees or immigrants. So that's just really shocking to hear. And I'm glad you made a positive at the end of it and like found peace within that.
Thanks. I think, right now the culture war is full on in the US, and part of the politics is that, MAGA and build a wall and all this is an effort to sort of make whiteness as a centrality in American life. But it only works in certain political circle. It doesn't work in real life. Culturally, you can see how complex and multi-culture we really are in the US. Even like Fox, who, sort of has that sort of support to, I won't mention his name, but, number 45. But that even Fox News, sort of lean toward this sort of MAGA narrative, actually is also a propounder of diversity in its cultural programming. So you have Glee, you have other things that are gay support, Simpson, whatever it is. So there is a contradiction, when you have this weird politics that is completely moving toward the right, but on the cultural level, friends of mine are winning Pulitzer Prizes and are creating incredible cultural content on Netflix and so on. So the contradiction in terms of like who we are politically is coming to like smack against this celebration of our diversity. You know what I mean? So I think the conflict is full on right now in the US.
I totally agree. And I feel like I want to know more about your perspective saying that it's like in the real life instance, because for immigration in the real life with 45, like it's realer. Like you have more of that threat again, that if you're especially Mexican American, that things might change very drastically for you in the drop of a hat. And I fear that now the basically the arrow is going to shift at Asian Americans because of COVID-19. And that would be a horrible thing to do, but that's basically what tactics were used for the first election. Anyway.
But the problem with it's ironic because yesterday Impetus, that's what I call him. He made meat workers essential services or whatever.
Right.
Well, considering 70% of meat workers are immigrants from Latin America and Asia, and so to me it's like, great, you want to make him essential, but then you don't want him to work. So it's like it's the false narrative. And I think that what you said about Fox News and Fox Entertainment are two separate, but they also want to make the money on both sides. So it's kind of like you have the Glee as kind of like we need to do that to bring in advertisers, but in the sense that we let Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson run rampant. So it's like, but now Fox is broken up. When I'm talking about a few years ago, now Fox Entertainment is owned by Disney, but still, even Disney tries to play both sides of they bought this Christian entertainment or entity that's very radical in a way that they're all trying to make money at each other.
But unfortunately, they make money from propounding a kind of stereotype a lot of time, in the kind of journalism that they do, like the Fox News. But I just find that there is, on the ground level, there's so much to celebrate, because the more politically tight and right wing it becomes in DC, the more diverse the real world becomes at the same time. It's almost like a thermodynamic reaction to it, it seems to me. There are more Vietnamese writing poetry than ever before, for instance, and if you want to talk about diversity, just look at who are at the front line of the nursing situation at the pandemic. Some of the Filipino-American news outlets have been covering the highest number of deaths among nurses tend to be Filipinos, because that's the major profession that they take up when they come to America. So while you have Asian American being attacked for whatever the reason they think is, you also have Asian American at the front line trying to save life. So I think there is this deep contradiction in America. And I think this is the time when you need more literary voices to point this sort of things out, so anyway.
Yeah, like adding on, go ahead.
I think I work in healthcare, and there are floors that you go to that Tagalog is spoken more among staff than, a matter of fact, many of the nurses were doctors in Philippines, but then they go and take the 6-month course to become nurses in the U.S. because they make more money here. And but I've had an incident a couple of weeks ago, and I think I shared it to the class. Was we have I work in the emergency room at Highland, and had a patient come in, and the doctor was Asian American, and he was like, I don't want to be treated by, and I was like, well, you see the door over there, see your way out, this is not going to be that, it's your choice, and sure enough, he stayed and was taken care of. But I've taken care of people with swastikas that they're like, well, I don't want that black nurse or whatever. I was like, well, then you could go. And sure enough, when their life is on the line, they want you to help them. So
yeah, and adding on to that, I kind of really think that since there's a lot more emphasis on like fact checking and just trying to check to see if fake news is right, like I think that's a good thing, what we have, but I kind of feel like it doesn't really get to the heart of a lot of this political polarization, which is mostly just kind of throwing arguments and opinions out at other people that can sometimes be very controversial, but also lead to a lot of like media press. So even people like you, Andrew, who actually work a lot with memoirs and fiction, kind of like you're basically kind of fighting this kind of political polarization by kind of sharing your experiences, allowing your readers to share with you like the feelings and ideas that and thoughts that you've gone through as part of the Vietnam War refugee.
Yeah, I think if anything, the role of literature should point out how contradictory life can be. And instead of rejecting that contradiction, people should actually think about it and live with it, but that's what good literature does, good art does. Just the idea that Trump is now shutting down immigration itself is contradictory to the fact that he's married to an immigrant. He's against change migration, but his wife was single-handedly responsible for change migration of several generations. You see what I mean? So that kind of contradiction should be brought into the fold and explored, rather than like, oh, he seems to stand against right? Because there's a lot of contradiction in people action. For instance, I see people who are pro-life, anti-choice protesters who are now against lockdown, arguing that
it represses their freedom.
Yeah, it's a
choice,
and that the economy needs to be revived, even if there is 2% mortality rate. If so then if you're pro-life and your argument is all life is precious, and now you're you're anti-lockdown because you say 2% is negotiable. Then what exactly is your stand on it? You know what I mean? So there's a lot of contradiction, but people don't live with contradiction. They just sort of gleefully, adopt this new thing and say, I'm for this without thinking twice about it. I know anti-immigrant people who are actually themselves children of immigrants and never think twice about it, or people who are anti-undocumented immigrants who then become flabbergasted when their favorite restaurant owner is deported because they say, I don't mean Joe, I mean somebody else. I personally know people who are related to me who shouldn't be anti-immigrants, but they are because they themselves are immigrants. But they're anti-undocumented immigrants and would say things like, people should come here legally. Well, this one person who's a relative of mine is a wine collector. And I say, if we're gonna deport all these people, your wine gonna triple in price because who's gonna pick the grape? And he said, well, I don't mean Napa.
Andrew, can I ask how this is getting covered in Vietnam? How is it perceived in Vietnam? The political polarization, the anti-Asian racism, the bizarre response to COVID. I mean, you mentioned that for its other flaws, Vietnam, the government has done an excellent job in shutting down COVID. You're coming out of quarantine. So what's the perception there? What's the perception there in Vietnam among Vietnamese of what's happening in the United States?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's an essay that I'm thinking about writing, but more of a longer piece. It's because one of the things that I experienced lecturing here is going to international schools here, who basically is private school, and they model themselves after like sort of American schools, so that their kids can go straight to America, from high school to college over there. They're all English speaking. They have American teachers, there in the schools, and these kids speak English just like American kids, but they're grown up here in Vietnam. And one kid asked me recently, this is before COVID, before the lockdown, is it safe to come to America? And I was taken back by that. And I said, what do you mean? He said, there's so much racism right now in America. I don't feel safe going over there anymore. I'd rather go to Australia or something like this. And I was taken back by that. And now, of course, with the news that coming out on how the US really mishandled the virus and the death rate, and that the US is shutting down immigration temporarily, at least. It gives this idea that America itself is no longer the land of opportunities, that in fact it's a completely changed landscape. And that is itself troubling, because to me, the United States had always had this incredible cultural cachet of advertising itself as sort of opportunity, American dream. It was, a siren call to a lot of people around the world who work tremendously, very hard to find passage to America, to make it in America. And the moment that the signal comes out of America, it's like you're not welcome. In fact, we're not what we seem to be. It's troubling, because the country called the United States start to grow old, because without a vision of itself, and without this idea that people can make it to America and rise to the top, even if it's a myth for in large part, it's a cultural cachet that had always served the United States, even during the war times. For instance, in Vietnam, the US was, waging a war, but it was also airing American television programming in Vietnam during that time. People were watching American films, and, they love American music and all that. So you have this sort of sort of a cachet where people wanted stuff from America, right? That may not be true anymore. That the United States just become just another country like Russia or China without, the big fanfare of a cultural offering. And that its opportunities and promises are fading away, and when that happens, it's just become just another country.
More questions from students?
Natalia is next. Natalia, are you there?
Hi, I am here, but that's okay. I'd rather hear from students. I'm faculty, and Kella and I can talk after. And I just want to say, Andrew, thank you so much for being here. I'm just ecstatic. So I'll go back to mute and let the students.
Okay.
Students are rocking it.
Emily, go
Emily?
ahead and unlock your mic and video, and you could ask your question.
Hello? Hi. I just wanted to go back to what you were saying in the beginning when you said that being part of a group of new wave of immigrants, you differed from what was previously known about Asian Americans. And I just wanted to ask if you could go into more detail of how you navigated within the Asian American community, and what was your experiences specifically with those that weren't Vietnamese? Like, were you able to make connections with them, or was there still like a divide?
Yeah, what we're talking about the mid '80s here, right? And like I say, the picture of the demographic of Asian America in the '80s was very different than what it is now, because immigration from Southeast Asia was just beginning, and before that, the large population of Asian American were American born, right? And you have Japanese who came out from the World War II experience, having suffered from this incredible racism and incarceration, were largely sort of removing Japanese culture from their own practices. I have friends who are third generation Japanese American who didn't speak any Japanese because their parents didn't want them to stand out. And the same thing with Chinese American I knew, who were born in the US in several generations. They can speak a few words, but a lot of them felt that it was a incredible pressure to fit in, whatever that means, right? And then you have Vietnamese and Cambodians and Hmong people who came in, and they didn't come the same way as the previous generation that came to America, which is individually or as a small unit. We came as a wave of population. Like in 1975 when we came, we did, I didn't come by myself. I came with my family, and I was part of this refugee group that like 100,000 of us in that refugee camp in Guam. What I'm saying is that we didn't integrate into America so much as we started our own little Saigon when we get to Orange County. You know what I mean? So there was a weird dynamic in which our nostalgia and our cultural religious practices changes the American landscape. And I discussed this in East, East, West, by the way, because what had happened is we came en masse and we carry our cultural practices with us. And instead of just integrating, a lot of us stay within the little Saigon culture or around it. And so you have temples, you have churches in Vietnamese, you have a restaurant that's springing up, and then we start making our own, spicy sriracha sauce and so on. And so next thing you know, we didn't, as a people anyway, sort of forget our past so much that we bring everything to bear with us as a group. And that changes the way Asian American started seeing themselves, that maybe it is okay to speak another language. Maybe it is okay to say my ancestors came from over there and we are this long string of history of immigration, that there's no shame having an accent, for instance, or that your grandmother make this fish sauce that smells, but everyone begin to love it over the time. So I think in a way it changes the way what Asian Americans look at themselves, by sheer dynamic of living. If you look at vegetables in California before Vietnamese and Hmong came to America, it was very deprived of what you have today. If you go to the farmer's market, and the farmer's market, now you will see bitter melon, lemongrass, gourd, all this beans from Laos. So immigrants didn't just come by themselves. They bring all this cultural and agricultural products with them, and it changes the way we practice our cultural practices in America. I think in that sense, Asian America have been radically challenged and changed because of immigration, and also because of globalization, where travel becomes easy back and forth. Well, not right now, obviously, because I'm stuck in Vietnam trying to get back to the US, but travel became easily integrated. The internet, shortened the distances, and you can watch Chinese or Vietnamese programming on the internet and so on. The way in which that was not available to previous generations that came to America. You don't have Chinese language TV or Japanese language programming in the 60s or 70s, right? You just have to watch this ABC or NBC shows, right? And so in a way, the diversity of America is radical because of globalization and immigration, right? And not to mention the food products that we eat and so on. And so it's not just Asian American identity that shifted, but I would argue that America itself has shifted because of immigration in very radical ways.
Thank you. I really appreciate your answer. I live in San Jose, so there's like a lot of Vietnamese Americans here. So I definitely think immigrants are a really big part in influencing the rest of Asian Americans.
I think sriracha is replacing ketchup, for instance, as the number one condiment.
Salva, you're next. Go ahead and unlock your camera and your microphone and ask your question.
All right. Hi.
Hi.
So I had a question about something you wrote about in your article. So I can just read the quote out. You said, it was in Andrew Lam's April 30th speech, right? That's the title of the article. So you said, Americans don't take defeat and bad memories very well. They make a habit of blaming small countries for things that happen to the United States. AIDS from Haiti, flu from Hong Kong or Mexico, drugs from Colombia, hurricanes from the Caribbean. So I feel like we can see that happening right now with the COVID-19 crisis. There's a lot of blaming China for the crisis, like our president called it the Chinese virus.
Right.
So I wanted to ask why you think America as a country doesn't take defeat or these issues very well. Why is there so much deflection of blame, and how can we start to change that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think part of growing up in America, there is a central propaganda that is very deep rooted. You have people who basically believe that America is the greatest country in the world, right? Why they believe that, I'm not sure, because how do you quantify something like that? And even people, on the right or left, they all share that. It's like, or in the middle, there is this sense that this is the greatest country, this is greatest generation, that sort of thing. You hear it all the time. And you don't know where they measure that against. I think part of the reason why this belief is so strong is because America won World War II and become very dominant as a global force around the world since that time. And of course, they also, since Korean War. But I think that sheen slowly, losing its lights. And And yet we're still holding on to this idea that we're the greatest and so on. So things like virus or something can't be our fault, right? It has to be something else. So, but it's not constructive. Like I say before, when I talk about how we are so centered that we don't really see the whole story, right? And the contradiction is so stark and obvious, but people are unwilling to live with those contradictions. Like when I say, the anti-Asian sentiment is also flying in contrast with Asian being dominant in the healthcare industry, taking care of people with HIV, with COVID problems. So, I think in a way, there is this weirdness in which we want to simplify things, right? So then we can understand how it works by simplification. But things in real life don't work out that way. It's like that complexity, that contradiction is what literature is about. It's like you try to show how complicated it is, rather than say, oh, it's China fault, or and so on. So because if you think about it, I've seen friends of mine on Facebook who basically are Native American, who post this funny but sad in a way joke about, yes, we don't want foreign virus that kill us, so that's why we were against the colonists from Europe. You know what I mean? So you can always have a different perspective on who's killing what and why. So I think in a way, a story can only be understood better if it allows different point of view to be shared.
Yeah, and I really agree with what you said about like the American dream losing its luster and losing its sheen. Yeah. You mentioned before that you were talking to one of the kids in the international schools in Vietnam. Yeah. So I went to an international school in the Middle East, and I sound American. Yeah. You probably couldn't tell me from any other person who
right.
And I can really see that happening, especially now with the whole COVID-19 crisis, and honestly, since the 2016 elections and the rise of social media. Yeah. Like I barely got here months before Trump became president. So like we really escaped that yeah. Like a tiny margin. But ever since then, it's just become like discovering how separated America is from the rest of the world. It's pretty crazy how single-minded America is about its own place in the world. Yeah. And I really do feel that luster is kind of going away ever since the crisis started. And I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, if that's fine. Yeah. So what do you think the implications of that would be, how, people are kind of losing faith in the American dream right now?
Yeah, I think it's a very dangerous thing, but it's hard to quantify. I've written about this, but my old professor at Berkeley and my mentor as well, Franz Sherman, he passed away some years ago. He first showed me his version of America by taking out the US dollar bill, and it has the American eagle, the symbol, with one side clutching arrows and the other olive branch. And he said, this is the complexity of America. And I say, why? And he said, well, America and USA are kind of a separate thing. USA is an entity that's constantly in thirst of resources and power and dominance, and it needs to do what it needs to do in order to maintain its empire ambitions and so on. But America is an idea, right? And the idea of America is powerful, right? You have liberty, you have individual rights, you have the right to, happiness and pursuit of your dreams and so on. And those things are incredible because it makes people buying into being American, right? This idea of opportunities, and you can rise above your station to become someone else, that whole transformative power. And I will tell you that I'm an example of that. I was this immigrant refugee kid who went to Berkeley, then later on to Stanford for journalism and so on. So I'm a prime example of what can happen if you go to America, right, and become an author and so on. And so when I stood in front of that international school, I think one of the reasons why I'm there is because I'm the prime example of what they wanted to become. Not necessarily a journalist, but someone who found his way, became successful in his own way through American system. But I start to see how this has become more and more a false narrative in people's minds because what's happening right now in America. And I think it's dangerous because without this shared in belief, just like the stock, it's all about feelings. So then without that shared belief, I'm not sure what will prop up America, because without this whole idealistic version of you can make it America and you can construct America in your own making, without the Bill Gates and Steve Jobs who bring vision to fold, America will grow old. It would just become just like a hungry USA, just like China or Russia, without offering a vision that of a larger vision of the future, right? And I think that's very dangerous because if that happens, there is no redemption to the country.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. Yeah.
I have a quick follow-up question to that. Like,
Yeah.
what do you think will happen in that vacuum? Like, what will come to fill the vacuum of that potential, the potential promise that America is supposed to hold?
Yeah, I think this is an argument for true leadership because leadership that is at a time of turmoil like this needs to articulate a shared vision. Right now, we have leadership that rule by division, right? Divide and conquer narrative that's happening in America. And the opposite actually is what we need right now. Someone who can articulate what it means to be part of this big country, the United States, right? Unfortunately, I don't know where that vision comes from. We had a visionist back with Obama in the early years, but now I don't know if there is someone of that stature who can articulate what it means and why we should unite. And, in the past, we have people like Kennedy who say things like, ask what the United States can do for you, but what you can do for the United States, that sort of thing. We need someone to articulate a vision of America again. And right now that is indeed a void, but there is a hunger for it, I can assure you. And there is a feeling of wanting to find that direction toward the right path to American life.
Andrew, what kind of advice do you have for young emerging writers, young emerging journalists in these times?
Yeah.
I mean, you came up as a writer and you described it very eloquently, and it wasn't easy. But these times, as you know very well, are not easy either. So what do you find yourself saying to young journalists, young writers, both in Vietnam and here? I don't know if it's different advice there than here either. That's
so I am trying to advise myself as well, because the narrative I'm working with is not necessarily related to this pandemic, and yet this pandemic has become sort of like the black hole that sucks every story in, and so it's very hard. It's very hard, but I think eventually you have to be convinced that whatever your passion, whatever story that you're passionate about, it still matters, and that in the end, there is always going to be a need to hear different narratives about whatever it is that is concerned to you, right? But there, when I went to Stanford, it was 9/11. I was an editor at the Pacific News Service, and 9/11 happened. And I didn't want to leave my writing desk to study at Stanford for a year while the whole world felt like it had imploded at that time. And I was, sort of like in this agitated mood. And one of the mentors I had at Stanford at that time, he told me that, listen, I know that being a journalist, you want to be out there and tell stories, but this is your year and you need to be here. And I can assure you that even a year from now, there'll still be 9/11 stories for you to tell, right? So there's a lot of stories you can pick from. And Franz Sherman, who also tells me this story, that when he was young, he wanted to tell everything that is important in this world. And as he grew older, he realized that of the 10 things he wanted to tell, if he's had any talent at all, there are probably 2 or 3 stories that he can tell really well. And so basically he said, choose your battle, right? Know which is your strength, work on that, and choose the battle, because you cannot fight a whole war on your own. So choose the battle where your talent is most applied, and work through that.
All right, and while I've got the floor here, let me mention it's quite far after midnight over there by now, and you're kind of reaching the point. We could take one more question, wrap up. Do you want to keep going? As you know, sometimes people will linger in the Heritage Room if we were actually on the Foothill campus and physically together. Sometimes authors can stay later, and sometimes they need to rush off. You might have a life. Or something, or a deadline.
So, let's take a couple more questions.
You want to keep going? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So more questions from students then. Let's keep going with that.
Jonah, go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
I realize you kind of answered this already, but I'll just ask for some specifics. I just want to know what kind of specific experiences stuck with you as an immigrant coming to America. Like, did you feel generally welcome? Did you face some kind of adversity? Just along this line.
So in my book, East Eats West, I have this whole chapter on my first English teacher in 7th grade. That's when I first went to school in America. And so my experience was one of generosity, because he kind of took me under his wings, because he knew I didn't speak any English. So he drove me home from school. He provided books for me to read, extra books. And I was in summer school, and he formed a book club of immigrant kids. And we read, the first book I read was The Wind in the Willow. And so I wrote all about that. And so I would say that my experience in America back in the late 70s was one of generosity and welcoming. And I think that definitely had a tremendous effect in my own development, because then I felt like, wow, that I bought into the idea of transformation. I bought into the idea that I too can, change myself, and found love for literature. So there were a lot of generous people like that. Of course, there was general racism as well, but I think the overall feeling was that it was a welcoming, generous America. And that actually had a very positive effect on my own development. What I fear now is that this deep resentment, this sort of blame the immigrant game narrative that is driving policies in America right now, and that actually has a negative connotation to being a newcomer to the U.S., and that definitely would have a bad outcome for development of young people who come, because they feel not wanted and not welcome, right? And they become less wanting to be participant in American life,
Okay. Did you have face any adversity, or did you just find it very welcoming and you faced?
Well, I mean, there's several things. Adversity would be poverty, because we lost everything when we came to America. And we live in this terrible hovel of a 2-bedroom with 16 people. So that itself was difficult. And then the other thing is, I think the idea that we were under pressure to become someone else so quickly that my own family dynamic really suffered because, while my parents wanted me to be Vietnamese, I just sort of like didn't want to at that time. And so I became very Americanized. And so there was a lot of conflict within the family. I become more like or less a mute or disobedient in my own way, whereas in traditional family in Vietnam, there was a hierarchy of, where like parents were always right and you follow the, edict, and that wasn't true in America. So the difficulty of adjustment in America was something that my whole family and I had to go through for a while, to find our bearing. And that itself is very difficult.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Rachel?
Rachel, are you there? Let's see. Rachel
Here we
Vo?
go.
We are, I might as well hop in here while we're picking up some more questions. We are getting to the point that many of my students will need to leave to other classes. Just so we know, students already know this. I'm just kind of mentioning it. So we will lose we'll lose a few viewers. People may have another class or a meeting or childcare or whatever it may be. But for those of you that are still here, maybe you can re-ask a question or ask a new question. I'm always full of questions, so I can hop in, but you've been doing so well, I'm hoping I can hear a few more student questions.
I think Jamie's
next.
So before all the students leave, I do have an announcement. I am a writer for the Foothill Poppy magazine at the Foothill campus. And it's been a pleasure. This is our last API Heritage Month, Andrew. So it's been great to kind of wrap this whole thing up with you. And I want to, we actually have an article, all of us do, on Sunday about API Heritage Month.
Huh.
The questions I will be asking students in our class and on campus just range to a huge range of topics just to learn about more students on campus. If they're passionate about something specific. I know we have a author of the Creative Release magazine in this class as well, Pavel, and we have a lot of international students in this class as well. So I want to get to know the students in my class more, and especially through this Zoom time, we can get to know each other better and write about their stories. So I linked the doc in the chat if you guys want to check out the questions I have, and you can look over it if any of them intrigue you. I would love to interview you about it, feature you in our magazine so you can have your story published and just, have something out there. But thank you for that. And yeah, feel free to contact me at albertonjamie@student.foothill.edu or yeah.
And let me also, Andrew, two questions that would go with that. My students will be writing for an online magazine that I edit on medium.com. And the title of the magazine, which was given by students, not by me, is The Global Citizen. Yeah. So I was partly wondering what you would, if I just threw that title at you, what you who managed to write so fast and so well. I'm always jealous of you. Every time I log on to anything that Andrew's site on Facebook or whatever, he's got 9 new articles coming out, and I feel like I haven't even written a paragraph. But I was also curious, if I can double up on the question, I was also curious, did you publish in any student literary magazines when you were coming up, like the Poppy at Foothill, or that's our sort of journalism magazine. We also have something called Creative Release. So were you publishing in student publications to begin with?
Well, when I was at San Francisco State in the creative writing department, I published in the magazine from San Francisco State called Transfer. And in fact, they were the first to publish my short story. My first short story was first published ever in Transfer magazine. So,
that's what I was thinking. Listen to that, students. It's fun that since we have a very large, San Francisco State is our largest transfer school. So it's fun. It's a fun accidental pun that it's called transfer.
Yeah.
All right. And then what about global citizen as I mean, I know this is kind of out of the blue curveball question, but how would you hit back if I said global citizen to you? What would come to mind from your perspective?
Well, I don't particularly think about that term in that way, but I do think that when I tell a story, I'm not limiting myself to the border of the United States. For instance, when you tell an immigration story, you're already connecting this place to that place, here and there. So I think being part of a global citizen means you probably have to find a way to integrate different ideas and different information from different places, rather than seeing yourself as simply inside one country. Because if you're an environmentalist, you cannot be just an American, right? Environmental issue is global. The virus is global. So all these things need to find a way to integrate into different parts of the world in order to make sense, and certainly American consumerism is global. With China shutting down, you can see how disruptive the supply chain is. So in a way, I think being a global citizen is to understand where things start and where they end, and how that loop is completely transborder.
Okay, good answer.
I have one question.
Yeah.
What's taking you back to Saigon, and what are you doing there, and are your plans to be there permanently, or you get to live a global life that you get to
I was living a global life until recently, where I had to cancel my flight back to the US because there were no flights. But I actually been here over a year and a half on and off, back and forth between here and San Francisco, because I was researching for a book that I'm working on, but also because I wanted to see what it's like to actually try to live in Vietnam, at least in part-time. And I learned a lot since I've been here. And I love the idea that I can be both here and there, simply hop on the plane and come back and so on. So it's been an eye-opening experience being in Vietnam. But I'm just hoping that global travel will pick up again, because I realize how American I am being here, in the sense that I love being here, but only if I can get back to America. I don't want to be here simply being stuck in Vietnam, because I think it's doubly ironic that because of the pandemic, that I'm actually taking temporary refuge in a country from which I fled as a child, as a refugee. So there's all kind of contradictory things that are happening right now.
Could I ask a question too, please?
Yeah.
Hello. It was nice. I saw you a couple of times now in Foothill, and it's amazing that you keep coming back to speak. So I was kind of stumbling on one quote of yours when you talked about literature and the role of it exposing contradictions. Mm-hmm. Which is, when I write, I think about that all the time. But the question of mine was related to the fact that when you're discovering contradictions in life around you in general, you kind of discover these same contradictions within yourself, if that makes sense. And I was wondering when you let go of these contradictions on paper, how do you handle this process yourself, like this emotional sense of letting go of this contradiction, especially when you know when someone else is going to read it?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if my question makes sense, but I hope it does.
Yeah, I'm not sure letting go is the way I look at the contradiction so much at addressing them. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you just have to live with them. One of my favorite quotes, although I probably am paraphrasing right now, is F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote about sort of being in the insane asylum because he had a nervous breakdown in Hollywood. And he talked about how the sign of first-rate intelligence is a mind that holds two opposed ideas in his head without going crazy. And I had always thought about that. So what he was saying is that there's this contradiction, and often we want to not have contradiction, so then we just accept one version and not the other. But it's up to your intelligence and your alchemy, let's say, to integrate those contradictions to make sense for you. So it's not necessary for me letting go so much as trying to find bridges and connection between this contradiction so that I can live with them. You know what I mean? So I think about the F. Scott Fitzgerald quote all the time when, you know, we live in the very complex world that we do.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question about like your experience coming to America as from like a South Vietnamese background with like a more privileged South Vietnamese background. Do you think that like a lot of the money and wealth that your father and I think your grandparents did as like the as like landowners, do you think that kind of changed your immigrant experience? And do you kind of feel like you felt discriminated in America as maybe like one of the first batch of South Vietnamese immigrants to America? And what was your experience like cloaking as an American in a way?
That's a series of complicated questions because it's nuanced. I mean, I came from a privileged background. My family was probably considered ruling class during the war, even earlier part of Vietnam history. So my background is that I'm always proud of that. On the other hand, when we got to America, we were dirt poor. So the only thing that we brought with us is that sense of having been in the position of power and so on. And I think in some way, as time goes on, I realized in a weird way, that itself is a kind of wealth. Because if you come from certain status and you know what it's like to get there, that experience is a kind of propulsion for you to regain some of that lost glory, let's say, or background. And so when people come to America with nothing, there's a difference between people who come to America with nothing and experience of having something and having worked for it, versus people who come to America with nothing, with no experience at all, and deprived of education, let's say. So in the case of my family, we integrated very quickly because my dad was educated, you know, and, you know, my family was educated. So then we enter American life quicker than other people who came from Vietnam, but with less education background. That is not to say they didn't become successful. I'm just saying that it made our integration in American life much faster and with facility in comparison with people who didn't have that kind of background. But yeah, I mean, there is discrimination being South Vietnamese because of, I think in a weird way, while there is amnesia, there's also this weird narrative that people ingested from Hollywood. So there's a lot of Vietnam War movies that has
like Apocalypse Now, that kind of thing.
Apocalypse Now and Deer Hunter and stuff like that, which has nothing to do with reality of the war, right? But people get sort of weird images from that, and then they assume that to be your story, you know? Like they say things that I was, they say, did you wear a conical hat and had black pajamas on? And I'm like, never had a conical hat in my whole life in Vietnam. I went to French school, so I don't, you know, and I lived in a French villa when I was a kid. So I don't really, you know, that's not something Hollywood would tell, you know what I mean? So my experience and what Hollywood trying to tell America about me is completely different reality.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I really liked your recent article about basically what's like your perspective in your condo and like the propaganda. And propaganda is really interesting to me. So I wanted to know, like, how do you feel about the loudspeaker in your condo that enforces the hygiene song and the overall propaganda in Vietnam? And why there are so many speculators about why there's 0 deaths. So like, why are people like, you know, there's people that are questioning it too. So I would definitely feel very like, get me out of this. I don't want to hear this every day. So I just want to hear more about what you're feeling right now with that around you.
Yeah, the propaganda is really interesting. I think someone's going to do study on how this propaganda machine that used to be very powerful and then become less powerful as Vietnam integrates into world economy and gets more and more sophisticated and less ideological, because really Vietnam is not a communist country. It's a really capitalistic country with a single party system that claimed to be communist, but it doesn't practice any of that. It's not even socialist, to be honest. It's just pure capitalist without democracy. But and so when it tried to teach communism, it falls flat because no one practices it. Everyone wants their kid to go to private school. Everyone start their own business. So it doesn't make any sense, like Leninist theories and so on, Marxist theories. I mean, so the propaganda didn't work for a long time now, since globalization, took off. And suddenly now it's come back fully because of the virus. But it's not an ideological, it is a tool that they had in the past, but they're using it to fight this virus. And so it's a lot more effective than before, because people actually perceive the virus as a real enemy and that they need to cooperate to get out of the situation. And so in a weird way, the old architecture of propaganda didn't work for the ideology of communism, but it's, I think, working pretty well as a tool to fight corona. And even the old posters of like workers unite is now where workers are wearing masks, what I mean? So I find that whole thing fascinating, but it's kind of not ideological. It's like, this is necessary, right?
Yeah, it's definitely seeming like we need this to survive. And I just think the rhetoric is really interesting, because it was like basically heroes in white, kind of like that similar rhetoric for the Vietnam War. And it's universal at this point. And the rhetoric here for the US just is a headache, because no one wants to really dive into the media at this point and get their information, because everyone's saying different things, and it's the perfect disaster and distraction from elections. As a follow-up question, I have, at the end of the article, you wrote that Vietnam sees COVID-19 like a war they've lost again. And why do the Vietnamese have this perspective that they lost, when the US are the ones that regret Vietnam and talk about it as a dark period? And then I also remember the article headlines you reference in your speech, and all of them are like kind of like relating them back to Afghanistan, and like basically, why do the Vietnamese like see this kind of like as a dark period and relate it back to COVID times?
Well, I think that Vietnam hasn't seen this kind of level of cooperation between people and government for a long, long time. The propaganda worked very well during the war in the North, because they united under Ho Chi Minh, and there is a sense that we need to sacrifice for the greater good. But that unification didn't last very long after the war, because people went south and they realized, my God, the South was wealthy. Why did we need to liberate the South? They say that the South was poor. In fact, it's a lot wealthier. Why are we under communism when, we should have like practiced capitalism earlier on, and so on. So there's a lot of questioning that happened after the war. And so the ideological thing that was working well during the war failed to work afterwards. And that's why you see more and more people fleeing the country as Vietnam was getting poorer after the war, and practiced sort of like this weird Marxist ideas that didn't work. So what happened now is that because people perceive like they need to believe in the government again, believe in this practice of hygiene, and listen to the music, and everyone is like policing each other, really, which is like the old police state in the past. To like, I've seen people like, you're not wearing a mask, you know, that sort of thing. I went to the market and this lady said, your mask is sinking. You need to put it over your nose, you know? So, and so there is the, you know, that was how it worked during the war and aftermath, is people policing each other for proper behavior, which is communistic in a way. Right now, it's not communistic, but it is proper behavior to save yourself from this virus. So in a way, we're returning to a kind of police state, but differently, you know, and the cost seems just and right. So people are organizing and cooperating with the government, whereas just last year, you know, before the virus even, there is a lot of suspicion and, you know, doubt about the government, right? But right now, people are working very well with the government because I think because they see a need to save themselves, you know. And people are suffering economically, but they're willing to sacrifice. So there's that theme as well during the war, you know. So,
would you say that people are still going to be trusting or reliant of their governments, like in the U.S. and Vietnam, in any country where they've had really great procedures to follow through? Would you think that they're going to be more trusting of their governments, or do you think there's going to be, again, like after this period, more people questioning, okay, why are we in lockdown so long?
Right.
Why is the fact that, like, in America specifically too, like, why has 45 put the reopening decisions in the hands of governors? Like, that just makes our country even more divided because, you know.
No, he's done that on purpose because if it goes wrong, he could blame them.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say if a state opens up too fast, he could easily blame them. But if it goes right, then he's gonna take praise.
Yeah, yeah. I think in a strange way, and I find myself kind of having a difficulty to say this, but in a weird way, an authoritarian system during this time works well because you don't necessarily have to believe in the government, but they can still make you stay home or you go to jail. Like, there's no freedom of movement here anyway, you know. So in a weird way, people don't get to go out and protest here against the lockdown. You know, you either accept it with stoicism or you just accept it. There's no other option really, or they can send you to the gulag, you know what I mean, to accept it there. Whereas in the US, there is a lot of freedom and individual rights, and people just don't necessarily follow the rules because they say this is bogus, man, that sort of thing. And from the perspective of infection and the virus, that's not conducive to, you know, flattening the curve. That's just the reality of it.
Yeah. Well, I'm really intrigued to see your perspective evolve and change with this crisis coming out and coming back to America. I definitely like see more from your perspective why you would want to come back here after this, or like right now, because I feel like even now when you Americans are in lockdown, there's still plenty of freedoms.
Yeah.
And people are not listening still.
Right. I also need to get back because like everyone I know, love is back there, so I need to get home. But right now, there are no flights to speak of, so I'm hoping by the end of June I'll be able to fly back.
Great. Hopefully we can see you in person.
Yeah.
I'll be at Foothill.
Now, Andrew, I'm going to ask you, do you want to keep going? It's 5 minutes after
I think
here.
Good, right? We should end it here. Should we?
Okay. So I'll kind of do my little wrap before I turn off the recording. So I just wanted to thank Andrew one more time for rejoining us at Foothill College. As you heard, he's one of our most popular authors in the English department, very widely assigned. English 1A, English 1B, English 1C, Asian American literature, American literature. It was really exciting to have you joining us from Saigon, even though we would actually kind of have preferred that you were able to come home too. And I want to mention to anyone who's listening in that if you go to the foothill.edu website and you search for API Heritage Month, we have links to all the articles that my students have been reading and referencing. And of course, you can find Andrew Lam's content on a whole variety of platforms. from Huffington Post to et cetera, et cetera. So Andrew is still a very active journalist, a very active radio personality, and I'm looking forward to hearing your voice on the radio, reading your stuff. I think you have a new book of short stories coming out soon, and the books that are behind Andrew are also available for sale now. So I wish I had books to wave. They're all done in my office because I'm always teaching them, and I don't have them here at home in Daly City. But thanks, Andrew, for joining us from Saigon for this 45th anniversary broadcast.
Stay safe, everybody, and hopefully see you all soon.
You will.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
And let's see, I'm stopping.